The Medici family, the true rulers of the Renaissance, Part 2. Giovanni de' Medici, or Pope Leo X as he now was known, had risen higher than any of his ancestors when he in 1513 became the first Medici Pope. He also inherited a fresh artistic legacy inside the Vatican itself, made by a man he had grown up with, Michelangelo. For 4 years, Michelangelo worked on a major commission in the Vatican. The late Pope Julius II had ordered him to paint the ceiling of the papal chapel inside the Vatican. But the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel was 1,000 square meters, and Michelangelo was convinced he was going to fail the biggest commission of his life. Michelangelo believed that the reason for him being forced into painting the Sistine Chapel was his enemies plotting, because they didn't want to see him succeed in sculpture. So, the man that we consider one of the greatest painters of all time, never actually thought of himself as a painter, and he hated every second he spent in the Sistine Chapel. Michelangelo covered the ceiling with around 300 figures and stories from the Bible, among them the flood, the origin of the stars, and the creation of Adam. Michelangelo had crafted brilliance, arguably the greatest painting of the Renaissance. But he was also fearful of reprisals against him because he had been working for the regime that replaced the Medicis, his former patrons and family. The authority of Pope Leo X and the Medici was soon carved across Florence, and everyone knew that their future and faith lay in his hands. Even Machiavelli, who had once defended Florence against the Medici, knew he was in a dire situation. He now started to lobby hard for a job inside Leo's papacy. However, unfortunately for Machiavelli, he was instead thrown in prison and tortured in horrible ways. Machiavelli barely survived the torture, and he was exiled from Florence in disgrace. He was forced to stay at his country villa and could not leave. He was trapped. Machiavelli now had a lot of time to think about the life he had lost, and began writing a handbook for aspiring dictators. With this, he hoped to impress the Medici family and be forgiven. He wrote one of the most infamous books ever written, The Prince. In the book Machiavelli writes, "Since love and fear can hardly exist together, if we must choose between them, it is far safer to be feared than loved." With this book, he would inspire dictators around the world, even today. In it, he describes a world where morality and compassion were completely removed from politics. Rulers who showed any of this was, in his opinion, weak rulers who soon would be toppled. According to Machiavelli, the prince should be a cynical ruler acting in terms of best interest of the state, meaning the ruler, not the ruled. He recognized the imperfect and inadequate nature of politics, which of course, was exactly the case in his own time and city. The prince was inspired by, and dedicated to the Medici, but Machiavelli's plan didn't work. The Medici refused to employ him, and instead, Machiavelli's name became a word for ruthless and cynical politics. In 1516, a group of cardinals conspired to commit the greatest crime of all, the assassination of the Pope. However, Leo had been warned of the conspiracy to kill him, and he would have the conspirators killed instead. Now the Medici cousins took steps to secure loyalty of those around them. Leo X created hundreds of new jobs in the Vatican and sold them to those he could trust. And he needed the money, because within just 1 year of his extravagant lifestyle, he had emptied the papal coffers. It's a classic mafia move to take over every single sphere, from top to bottom, of how the papacy was run. Soon Leo X owed money to every bank in Rome. In secret, he was pawning the papal jewels, and being desperate, Leo now turned to the source of income only available to the Pope: the sale of forgiveness. These were basically pieces of paper which give you remission from sins. So if you've been naughty in some respect, the Pope would sell you an indulgence which would cleanse your sins. Leo X wasn't the first Pope to sell indulgences, but he sold them on an unparalleled scale, and his prices was affordable for even the poorest people. And Leo found a ready market across Europe. The sale of salvation was a gold mine for the Pope. An indulgence could even be bought on behalf of the dead so that their soul might be spared on its journey to heaven. Profits from the sale of absolution were now lifting the Medici Pope out of debt. But for one man, a German monk named Martin Luther, this was a step too far. Luther was absolutely horrified by what the Church was doing, and for him it symbolized everything that was corrupt and decadent about the Catholic Church. In 1517, Martin Luther published a manifesto for change, and with a new technology, it was printed, reprinted, circulated, and translated. No idea had ever traveled so far and so fast, and it was a direct attack on the Pope and the papacy. Luther said, "The Pope is richer than Croesus. He would do better to sell St. Peter's and give the money to the poor. Those who believe there can be certain of salvation because they have bought indulgences will be eternally damned." No one had ever before dared use such outspoken language against the might of the Catholic Church, and it was the start of a revolution. Before long, Luther's manifesto made its way back to Leo. But the complaints of an ill-tempered monk mattered little to him. The Pope drew up a standard document designed to silence heretics. He excommunicated Luther and condemned him to hell. Being excommunicated by the Pope implies being denied access to heaven. And if you were a Christian, you would care very much about that. But Luther refused to accept this, and his refusal triggered a battle for the souls of Europe. The Protestant Reformation was a revolution, and it split the Church down the middle and in two. However, the Pope would not live to fight his battle with Luther, because in 1521, Leo X suddenly died. The Medici pontiff had died from a simple cold. His cousin, Giulio, was now left to deal with the mounting problems. And within 2 years, Giulio de Medici was crowned Pope Clement VII. The second Medici Pope inherited a continent in crisis, and the fallout from Luther's Reformation now brought armies to Rome itself. For Catholics, Rome was the city of pilgrims. It was the city where St. Peter was buried. It was the seat of the papacy. It was a sacred city. But to the men surrounding Rome, there was nothing that remained sacred about the Catholic Church, and they were fueled by deep religious hatred. In fear of his life, Pope Clement fled to the safety of the Sant'Angelo, and his fears were very much justified, because the very next day, Rome was torn apart without mercy. They ravaged the city, raping, violating sacred buildings, and they kept the Pope trapped in Sant'Angelo. The sack of Rome was horrendous. It was one of the darkest moments during the Italian Renaissance. After 7 months under siege, Clement put on some rags. He had the papal jewels removed and all the gold melted down. With his valuables sewn into his clothes, Clement was able to bribe his way out of Rome and headed for Florence. But news traveled faster than the Pope, and the enemies of the Medici in Florence were already in revolt. They attacked what symbolized the Medici regime, and they attacked the buildings, which was the embodiment of that. During the riot, a bench was hurled from City Hall and damaged Michelangelo's David, the city's greatest symbol, all in defiance of the Medici. In the wake of the chaos, Pope Clement stood poised to attack Florence, but captive inside Florence was the last legitimate heir to the Medici line. Clement's niece was 11 years old at the time, and her name was Catherine de Medici. Clement called her, "my pearl beyond price," and he knew precisely what she was worth to the Medici family. Unfortunately, so did the people of Florence. They threatened to throw Catherine into a soldier's brothel unless Clement agreed to a truce. And Clement withdrew his troops, for he had great plans for Catherine de Medici. The Pope soon capitalized on Catherine's survival, because within 3 years, he married her off to the son of the French king, and she would later become the Queen of France. She was only 14 at the time of her marriage. The unrest which the Medici had sparked traveled with her. Because under the reign of Queen Catherine de Medici, religious hate would also infect France. In Rome, Clement VII was becoming old and wanted to make one last grand gesture before he died. He summoned the man he'd grown up with, Michelangelo. He ordered a massive fresco inside the Vatican that would be the last work Michelangelo did for the Medici. But the result would also reflect Michelangelo's mood towards his patrons. Over the altar of the Sistine Chapel, Michelangelo chose to portray the Last Judgment. In 1537, the first Duke of Florence, Alessandro de Medici, was assassinated. He was the illegitimate son of the former Medici Pope. The assassination of Alessandro was done by a distant cousin, Lorenzino, from the family's junior branch. He was in turn murdered in 1548 in retaliation. Many hypotheses have been proposed to explain the reasons for the murder, from the personal resentment caused by jealousy or patrimonial reasons, to Lorenzino's desire to make a sensational gesture to immortalize his glory. Running out of male heirs, Cosimo de' Medici, a fourth cousin to the murdered duke, received his summons to Florence. He was 17 at the time. Because after years of chaos, the city of Florence was in decline. Its streets were deserted, and generations of Medici treasures had been destroyed. Even Michelangelo had fled the city, leaving behind the broken statue of David. Young Cosimo bore the name over the now hated dynasty. But the city was on the brink of anarchy and needed someone to fill the dangerous role of the figurehead of Florence. Cosimo the teenager would have to do, and within 2 days, Cosimo was elected the second Duke of Florence. The Medici had always patronized the arts, but with Cosimo, the arts became part of politics and PR for the Medici. Michelangelo was the greatest artist of the age, and his art was often used by others for political gain. The Medici enemies all over Tuscany were plotting to bring down the arrogant young duke, because Cosimo was developing royal aspirations. He courted a Spanish princess, a woman who shared his ambitious nature, Bella Eleonora. She brought a lot of prestige to the Medici, because she was the daughter of Pedro de Toledo, the Spanish viceroy of Naples, of very much superior rank to Cosimo the Duke. The wedding guaranteed Cosimo Spanish protection and a very much needed approval of his regime. Bella Eleonora also brought Cosimo a very handsome dowry, but most importantly, she also brought an army. But the Medici's living quarters, Palazzo Vecchio, didn't impress the new duchess. She was very disappointed. She came from Naples, the largest city in Europe at the time, with roughly 300,000 inhabitants. Florence, in contrast, had only about 60,000 inhabitants, and the Palazzo Vecchio was nothing like the palace she had grown up in. Going against all the traditions of the time, she purchased Palazzo Pitti, a fortress, and this would be where she would raise the new generation of Medici. Cosimo had ambitions and planned to spread his duchy further in Tuscany. The Republic of Siena fell at the first attempt, and the rest of Tuscany soon followed. He had won decisively. But even with the new gains he had made, Florence was still a very hostile place for the young duke. When he walked through the city with his family, he had body armor underneath his clothes and was always protected by at least 100 men with muskets. For his and the family's safety, Cosimo built new buildings where he had an enclosed private corridor above the streets. It was more than a kilometer long, and Cosimo now had a safe passage through the city. Michelangelo, now in his 70s, resented Cosimo's dictatorial style. The family who had discovered him, nurtured him, but also bullied him, and Michelangelo had had enough. He refused to go back to Florence. Michelangelo was angry, bitter, and tired. This was a source of frustration to Cosimo, that Michelangelo wouldn't have anything to do with him, and remained in Rome for the last years of his life. Giorgio Vasari, a person close to the Medici, thought that the new period needed a word for its outstanding achievements. He called it Rinascimento, rebirth, or the Renaissance. But the ideals of the Renaissance movement now offended the most powerful authority in Europe, the Catholic Church. Humiliated by the Protestant Reformation, the Church's power had dwindled. The new Pope, Paul IV, in 1559 sent the Inquisition to Florence. They had come to enforce the censorship of the Church. The Inquisition had a list of 583 forbidden books of heretical works, many of them being in possession of the Medici, and owning one of these was heretical. Cosimo haggled with the Inquisition and was able to reach a compromise. He organized a public book burning. Because he could not afford to alienate the Church, he needed the formal recognition by the Pope if the Medici were to hold on to power in Tuscany. In 1569, Cosimo de' Medici got what he wanted, and he was crowned Cosimo, Grand Duke of Tuscany, by Pope Paul IV himself. All of Tuscany now stood in awe of the new duke, including a young boy who would one day contribute greatly to the Medici legacy. He would become the greatest scientist of the time and challenge the Catholic Church in a way that had never happened before. His name was Galileo Galilei. The Medici house was a great stage for Galileo. He was very much unique. He was a scientist, something most people hadn't heard about before. Galileo cast glory over the Medici and his court, and he was soon appointed as mentor of the young Medici princes, who would have an entirely different education than anybody else at the time. In 1610, the Medici made Galileo a royal professor of mathematics and philosophy, with a very nice pay of 1,000 scudi a year. Galileo, needless to say, ensured that his discoveries first was shown at the court of the Medici, casting glory over the ruling family. But what Galileo discovered was dangerous. It went against everything people had been believing and what the Catholic Church had preached for almost a millennia. Galileo was the first to discover that the sun had spots, to notice the unusual shape of Saturn, and he also identified the Milky Way. He was the first to spot the moons of Jupiter and named these curious objects after his patrons and protectors. He now called them nothing less than the Medici stars. In this way, thanks to Galileo, the Medici name was now written into the universe, and Galileo was the most famous scientist in Europe. What had started as a local revolution had now spread beyond the borders of Tuscany. At the royal court of France, the world's first ballet had been presented to Queen Catherine de Medici. In England, Shakespeare had thrilled audiences with extraordinary new plays, while in Italy a radical new art form had been unveiled. But there was still a force in Europe, more powerful than the wisdom of an individual thinker: the force of religion. A friend of Galileo had paid the ultimate price for intellectual freedom. Giordano Bruno was a Dominican friar. He had devoted his life to the service of God, but he was also a scientist. For publishing his theory that the universe was infinite, he was burned alive by the Roman Inquisition. Galileo knew how powerful and dangerous the truth could be, and he knew his own ideas were testing the Inquisition's patience. For more than 1,000 years, the Church had taught that the sun and all the planets revolved around the Earth. Galileo had come to the radical conclusion that the Earth, in fact, revolved around the sun. His discoveries threatened the whole notion of the Christian cosmology. The choice that now faced Galileo was simple: deny the truth to save his neck, or publish and be damned. Galileo therefore prepared a subtle argument in the form of a conversation between three friends, claiming it was a fictional discussion. They just happened to be discussing the structure of the universe. Galileo called his book The Dialogue of the Two World Systems, and dedicated it to his student and patron, the Grand Duke of Tuscany. When the dialogue hit the streets of Florence, it became an instant bestseller. Galileo had written the first book of popular science. Nevertheless, when the dialogue reached the headquarters of the Church in Rome, Pope Alexander VII was furious, and Galileo was summoned to Rome and now had to face the Inquisition. In 1633, Galileo arrived in Rome. It was a trial in the 17th century sense of the term. It wasn't a trial in the way we mean it today. Not only were there no jury, but the suspect had very little access to the case that was being built against him. Galileo was also ordered to dress in the white robes of a penitent. He was being humbled, and shown who was the true rulers in Europe: the Catholic Church. He was humiliated, and then pressured in a way that only the Inquisition could do. Even the Medici Grand Duke now felt the pressure and stopped paying Galileo's salary, his former teacher. On the 22nd of June 1633, on his knees in the heart of the Vatican, Galileo denied the truth and saved his own life. Galileo was sentenced to house arrest in Tuscany. Sadly, he died an old and broken man. The Medici wanted to pay their respects to Galileo, and planned a great public funeral for him, but the Pope opposed it, and prohibited a public funeral. There would be no public mourning for one of the most important scientists of all time, Galileo Galilei. In 1661, Cosimo III married Marguerite Louise d'Orleans, a granddaughter of King Henry IV of France and Marie de Medici. The marriage was a pure political one, and the two didn't enjoy a happy marriage, but they had 3 children, one of them being the last Medici Grand Duke of Tuscany, John Gaston de Medici. By 1705, the Grand Ducal treasury was virtually bankrupt after Florence population had declined by 50%, and the population of the Medici's Grand Duchy had declined by 40%. The biggest European powers, knowing that the Medici had lost much of their grip on the city, had no papal protection, and was without any real military power. They were now circling like vultures over the Medici's Florence and Tuscany. The Medici desperately tried to reach a settlement with the European powers, but Tuscany's legal status was very complicated. The area of the Grand Duchy formerly comprising the Republic of Siena was technically a Spanish fief, while the territory of the old Republic of Florence was thought to be under Austrian imperial dominion. Cosimo de' Medici contemplated restoring the Florentine Republic upon his sister Anna Maria Luisa's death, or on his own, if he died before her. However, the most important European countries ignored his plans. Only Great Britain and the Dutch Republic supported him. The Medici was reduced to a spectator at the conference for Tuscany and his family's future. Great Britain, France and the Dutch Republic and later Austria selected Don Carlos of Spain, the elder child of Elizabeth Farnese and Philip V of Spain, as the new Tuscan heir. Cosimo died in 1723 and the last male heir of the Medici dynasty, John Gaston de Medici, was homosexual and died without having any children. The extinction of the main Medici dynasty and the accession in 1737 of Francis Stephen, Duke of Lorraine and the husband of Maria Theresa of Austria, led to Tuscany's inclusion in the territories of the Austrian crown. When Anna Maria Luisa de Medici, Cosimo's sister, the last of the main Medici family line, passed away in 1743 without any children, she willed the Medici's enormous art collection and other treasures to the Tuscan state, on the condition that they would always remain in Florence. For almost 300 years, one family, driven by ambition and greed, had flexed their enormous power, forcing their will, not only on Florence, but on the entire European continent. The Medici family had sparked the Reformation, trailblazed a new form of banking and use of economic power, in a way that would inspire later titans and financial rulers, like the Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, Bill Gates, and many others. These people would become at least as powerful as the Medici, but their reach would stretch much further than one single continent. The entire world would be the playground for the new economic rulers. The Medici had left an extraordinary legacy in their wake, both for good and bad. They had been the patrons of brilliant Renaissance artists who had changed the Western world. In the Medici name, daring artists had created the greatest works of the Renaissance, and what had started in Florence could now not be stopped. New ideas and a new force had been unleashed upon Europe. Now the spirit of reason, science, the arts and economic power had conquered the European people and their minds. This would help to spark a new age, the Age of Enlightenment, where science would give us new and important insights on how nature and the world around us works, and how we can improve it and evolve further. But the Medici had also been brutal, killing thousands of people as a consequence of their lust for power, and showing the way on a new way of wielding power through economics. Many patrons of the arts would try to follow in the Medici's footsteps, but none would ever match the legacy of the Medici family. They had been the true rulers of the Renaissance. I hope you found this presentation interesting, and if you did, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe, and remember to push the bell button so you get a notification next time I upload a video. And please leave a comment below on what your thoughts are about the Medici family. And I hope to see you in the next one.